What if you were invited to a dinner party that turned into a murder scene? Now imagine being Detective James, a man more comfortable with cold cases than champagne flutes. Yet an invitation from Mr. Archibald Hampton, a wealthy philanthropist known for his charitable work, was too enticing to pass up. James saw this as a golden opportunity to network and perhaps gain some insight into the upper echelons of society. So he found himself at the Grand Hampton Manor, a place brimming with a lively mix of socialites, politicians, and business magnates. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. But beneath the lively atmosphere and warm greetings from Mr. Hampton, something felt off. As James navigated through the crowd, he couldn't shake off an undercurrent of tension. It was like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. As James mingled with the high society, he noticed a tension that was hard to ignore. The evening was in full swing, but not all was as joyful as it seemed. As the guests indulged in lively conversation, a subtle undercurrent of tension began to emerge. The source of this tension was none other than the host, Mr. Hampton, and his wife, Lady Eleanor. Their interactions were laced with an icy undertone, a stark contrast to the warm, cordial exchanges of the other guests. As the evening progressed, the tension between the couple escalated. Their words, once whispered, grew sharper, their voices louder. Lady Eleanor's face, initially flushed with merriment, was now a canvas of distress. Suddenly, with a swift movement, she rose from the table, her chair scraping against the marble floor. With a glance that could freeze a summer's day, she stormed off, leaving a trail of whispered speculations in her wake. James had a feeling that this was more than a marital spat. Little did he know, he was right. The party was in the drawing room when a sudden commotion turned the lively atmosphere into a scene of horror. A piercing shriek echoed around the manor, drawing a path to the dining room where Lady Eleanor lay slumped over the table. Her face, once vibrant and full of life, was now locked in an expression of pure terror. The realization hit the room like a thunderbolt. She had been poisoned. Chaos ensued. The guests, once jovial socialites, were now terror-stricken, their faces a mirror of the horror they had just witnessed. The room filled with a cacophony of panicked voices, the air thick with fear and confusion. The manor, once a place of celebration and joy, had turned into a crime scene. Detective James, however, was a beacon of calm amidst the storm. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the room, taking in every detail. His mind was already whirring, piecing together the puzzle that was laid before him. He sprang into action, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Everyone stay where you are!" he commanded, his authority silencing the room. He moved swiftly, cordoning off the crime scene and calling for backup. He knew he had to act fast. The killer was still among them, hiding in plain sight. He needed to gather as much information as possible before the trail went cold. One by one he began questioning the guests, their faces pale under the harsh lights. Their stories were a mix of shock and denial, a cocktail of fear and disbelief. Yet, as James listened, his gaze kept returning to one person, Mr. Hampton. Mr. Hampton, the grieving widower, seemed strangely composed. His face was a mask of calm, his eyes devoid of the shock and horror that gripped the other guests. It was a calmness that was unsettling, a calmness that didn't fit the scene. As the room filled with panic, James saw Mr. Hampton's calm demeanor. It was a calmness that didn't fit the scene. The plot was thickening, and Detective James was ready to dive right in. The night was far from over, and the game of cat and mouse was just beginning. With a room full of potential suspects, James had to stay focused and start connecting the dots. In a house filled with socialites, politicians, and business magnates, finding the killer was like finding a needle in a haystack. But James was not an ordinary detective. His keen eye for detail and sharp intuition were his greatest assets. He began by cordoning off the dining room, transforming the scene of the crime into his personal laboratory. James was methodical, scrutinizing every inch of the room for clues while the rest of the guests watched in horrified silence. As he proceeded with his investigation, James couldn't help but notice Mr. Hampton's eerie calmness amidst the chaos. This was a man who had just lost his wife in a horrific manner, yet he seemed oddly composed. Something didn't add up, and James was determined to find out what. He decided to focus his investigation on Mr. Hampton, digging deeper into his relationship with Lady Eleanor. He found that beneath the glittering surface of their marriage lay a web of deceit and betrayal. Lady Eleanor had been having an affair with one of the guests, a prominent politician, and Mr. Hampton had known about it. As the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, James realized that Mr. Hampton had a clear motive for murder. Consumed by rage and humiliation, he could have poisoned his wife during dinner. The evidence was mounting against him, and it seemed like James had found his killer. But just when he thought he had unraveled the mystery, the night took an unexpected turn. As he confronted Mr. Hampton, the lights in the manor suddenly went out. When they came back on, Mr. Hampton was lying on the floor, dead. He had been poisoned, just like his wife. Just as he thought he had nailed the suspect, the night had one more twist in store. This was no longer just a murder investigation, it was a deadly game of cat and mouse. James knew the real killer was still among them, and he was ready to unmask the true culprit. In a shocking twist, the accuser became the victim. The candlelit opulence of the manor was abruptly swallowed by an unnerving darkness. A chilling silence fell upon the room, only to be shattered by a gasp of horror. As the lights flickered back to life, they revealed a sight that sent a jolt of dread through everyone present. Mr. Hampton, the grieving widower, was lying lifeless on the floor, his face twisted in an echo of his wife's final expression. James knew instantly that this was no mere coincidence. The poisoner had struck again, and this time their target was none other than Mr. Hampton. But why? And who among the guests was capable of such a cold-blooded act? An icy realization settled in James's mind. The real killer was still among them, hiding in plain sight, their hands stained with the blood of two victims. A dangerous game was afoot, a deadly dance of deception and death. No longer were they mere guests at a dinner party, but players in a sinister plot, each one a potential suspect, or the next victim. James's mind raced as he began to piece together the jigsaw of events. The tension between Mr. Hampton and his wife, the clandestine affair, the abrupt blackout, and now, 2 murders. Nothing was as it seemed in this labyrinth of lies and betrayal. And yet, amid the chaos, a pattern began to emerge. The pieces fell into place, one by one, forming a picture of deceit and desperation. A picture of a politician, cornered by his own indiscretions, willing to kill to keep his secret. A picture of a man, betrayed by his wife, poisoned by the very person he had trusted. But the most chilling piece of the puzzle was yet to be found. Who among the guests had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit such a heinous crime? The answer was hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The game had changed. The real killer was still in the shadows. With 2 victims and a room full of suspects, James had to rely on his wits and skills. The detective's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but his face remained calm, his gaze steady. He knew that beneath the polished veneer of high society, secrets were often hidden in plain sight. James began to weave together the threads of the evening. The tension between Mr. Hampton and his wife, the hushed whispers, the stolen glances. He remembered Lady Eleanor's sudden departure from the dinner table and the equally sudden silence that had fallen over the room. He recalled the unnerving calmness of Mr. Hampton following his wife's death, and the subsequent chaos when his body was discovered. Then there was the politician, a man of influence and power, caught up in a scandalous affair. He had the motive and the means to commit such a heinous act. James could see it all now, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. It was the politician who, in a desperate attempt to conceal his affair, had poisoned Lady Eleanor, but he didn't stop there. To divert suspicion away from himself, he had poisoned Mr. Hampton too, cleverly framing him for his wife's murder. But the politician had underestimated James. The detective's sharp intellect and keen observation skills had allowed him to see through the deceit. He confronted the politician, his voice steady, his eyes hard. There was no room for doubt, no room for denial. The evidence was clear, the motive undeniable. The politician's facade crumbled under the weight of his crimes. He was arrested, his reputation in tatters. The room fell silent, the guests looking on in shock and disbelief. In the end, the truth behind the deadly dinner party was revealed, and justice was served. The detective left the manor, his job done, but as he stepped out into the cool night air, he knew that this was just another chapter in a book filled with unsolved mysteries and unspoken secrets.